That Sunday dinner. I can still hear the silverware clinking on the ceramic plates and the loud, echoing laughter of our relatives. The smell of roasted chicken was thick in the air, but to me it was just the smell of humiliation. It was the smell of failure served up on a fancy dish. We were sitting around the long dining table, both my family and my wife's parents. I had been trying. I had smiled, told a terrible joke, trying to make everything look quiet and normal. But that hope shattered the moment my wife dropped the folded stack of bills right in front of my plate. That sharp thud wasn't loud, but it cut through the laughter like a blade. It tore through the pretense I had been wearing for months. "You can't even pay the mortgage!" Her voice was sharp as a knife. She didn't yell, but every word had the weight of a stone. "Tell me, what kind of husband are you?" My stomach clenched. I could feel the blood drain from my face as the past due notices the red ink spread across the table like a public accusation. I knew it. I had failed, but being exposed in front of everyone. That was a different kind of torture. Her brother Mark leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Well, maybe if you spent less time chasing dead-end ideas and more time working a real job, you wouldn't be in this mess." He paused, sipping his wine. That pause, it was deliberate. It was an emphasis. My father-in-law cleared his throat, shaking his head, a look of deep disappointment on his face. They had always seen me as a failed project, a man not good enough for their daughter. And my own father? He said nothing. He just looked down at his plate. He had taught me to be silent when humiliated. That silence, it hurt more than any words. It was his agreement with them. "Our children deserve better than this," my wife said, her voice rising now, fueled by anger more than sadness. "Do you even realize how humiliating it is to beg my parents for help while you sit there pretending everything's fine? You're not fooling anyone." My daughter's fork slipped from her hand, clattering against her plate. She looked at me with wide eyes, not angry, not mocking, just confused, terrified. She saw her father sitting there, letting himself be torn apart, and she was learning a terrible lesson about helplessness. I wanted to shout. I wanted to smash everything. I wanted to tell them I had been trying, that I had been fighting. But the truth was I couldn't pay the bills. I had failed. And so I stayed silent. That silence became the heaviest part of the night. Finally, I stood. My chair scraped against the floor louder than I expected. I muttered something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse. Then I turned my back and walked out. I left behind the sound of clinking glasses and whispered words. I leaned against the cold wall outside, pressing my hand against my chest as if I could hold myself together. She was right, and that was the worst part. I had failed not just the world, but the people who depended on me most. The truth is, I was already too familiar with humiliation. It didn't start at that dinner, but years earlier on my father's farm and in the house I grew up in. Our family farm had been collapsing slowly, season by season. The barn roof was leaking, the cattle were thin. Neighbors whispered that my father had lost his touch. But every failure was laid at my feet. If a fence broke, it was my fault. If the tractor stalled, it was because I hadn't maintained it carefully enough. If the crops withered, it was because I didn't work hard enough. My father, he never missed a chance to remind me of it. And worse, he always reminded me in front of others. He used public shame as a way to unburden his own deep sense of failure. I still remember the night everything snapped, another Sunday dinner with all the relatives. I was 17, a big but awkward teenager. My father, red-faced from drink, slammed his fist down on the table. The dishes rattled, and that sound, it's etched into my memory. "This boy is the reason the farm's dying," he roared. "Lazy, useless, he's just the shadow of Miles." Miles was my cousin, who had left the rural town for the city and become a lawyer. Miles was the standard. I was the failed comparison. His words cut deeper than any blade. My uncles laughed under their breath, my cousins smirked. And my mother, she just stared at her plate, too afraid to defend me. My mother's silence was my first lesson in abandonment. The humiliation didn't stop there. The next morning at the local market, a neighbor nudged another, saying loud enough for me to hear, "That's the boy who couldn't keep his father's farm alive, just like his old man, failure upon failure." Their chuckles followed me like shadows. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I was already broken inside. The fights at home grew worse. My father's disappointment turned to rage, and his rage turned to insults. "You'll never amount to anything. You're not a real man. You're a liability." Words like that, they don't fade. They echo for years, replaying when I tried to sleep, when I looked in the mirror, when I dared to dream. I tried to work harder, waking before dawn, working until my body gave out. I wanted to prove him wrong, but no matter what I did, it was never enough. My father wasn't looking for help. He was looking for someone to blame. Then a terrible storm rolled in, tearing through the fields, flattening what little crop we had left. A natural disaster became a personal tragedy. That night I stood in the mud, holding a broken tool. Rain was pouring. My father turned on me, shouting so loud the neighbors gathered by the fence. "You cursed this farm. You're a disgrace. Everything you touch turns to dust." He shoved me hard enough that I stumbled, falling face first into the cold mud. In that moment, with the rain mixing with my tears and the mud on my tongue, I knew there was no place left for me there. That was the night I left. I thought the humiliation had burned so deep I would never recover. I walked away with the firm belief that I deserved it. Leaving wasn't a choice, it was survival. That night, after my father shoved me into the mud in front of the neighbors, I packed a small bag, leaving behind my old truck and the family name that had brought me so much shame. I walked down the long dirt road without looking back. The storm outside was still falling, but the storm inside me was louder. With every step sinking into the soaked earth, I felt myself walking away, not just from a farm, but from my identity. I was trying to erase the old me. I thought my mother would stop me. She would call out, beg me to stay. She didn't. She stood by the window, her face pale in the dim light, gripping the lace curtain. Her lips moved. I thought she might have said, "Don't go," but no words came out loud enough for me to hear. That silence, it hurt more than my father's rage. Silence was permission. Silence was abandonment. The city was colder than I expected. Not because of the weather, but because no one cared who I was. I was just another stranger trying to make rent, trying to hide the accent that tied me to a dying farm. I found a small damp room that smelled of old coffee and loneliness, where I could hide from the world. I took jobs that broke my back. Washing dishes, hauling crates, sweeping floors. I worked nights, I worked holidays. Every night I lay on a mattress in a cramped room, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had really escaped, or if I was just running in place. Calls from home were rare. When the phone did ring, it was never my father. Once my mother's voice slipped through, trembling. She asked if I was eating enough, sleeping enough. She didn't ask if I was happy. And then just as quickly she hung up. No, come home. No, we miss you. Just fragments of care swallowed by fear. Years passed, and I drifted. The separation wasn't just physical. It was a slow death of connection. However, the real crushing divorce came later in my own home. The morning after that humiliating dinner, my wife found me on the steps. She didn't yell this time. She just said, flat and cold, "I can't live like this anymore." And then she walked past me. I slept in the car that night. The morning after, she stood in the kitchen and simply said, "I want a divorce." Just like that. No shouting, no tears. Just 4 words, flat and final, dropped onto the table like a death sentence. She slid a folded piece of paper across the table, her list of what needed to be divided: custody of the kids, the mortgage. It was a premeditated plan. My daughter started to cry. My son stared at me, waiting for me to fight back, to say something. But I couldn't. I had lost my voice, lost my strength. I packed my things. I remember carrying boxes out to the car while the kids stood in the doorway. My son clenched his fists, holding himself back from asking me not to go. My daughter hid behind him, tears streaming down her face. I kissed their foreheads one by one and walked away. I couldn't tell them I would be fine, because I knew I wouldn't. I only said, "I love you." That was all I had left. That was the separation, not just from my wife, not just from the house, but from myself. I had become what my father called me: a failure, a runaway. Life in the city was supposed to be my fresh start, my great escape. But instead it became my undoing, a downward spiral more enduring than the farm's collapse. I scrubbed restaurant floors until my knees bled, carried crates until my shoulders felt like tearing apart. I told myself this was temporary, that I was building towards something. But months stretched into years, and nothing changed. I was stuck in the tiny apartment, the one with the stained carpet and the smell of damp clinging to everything. Every door I knocked on stayed shut. When people asked about my background, I froze. What could I say? That I had fled a dying farm, branded a failure by my own father. I started inventing stories, tales of successful, non-existent jobs. The lies only made me feel worse. Loneliness has a sound. It's the hum of the refrigerator at midnight, the echo of footsteps in a hallway. No one walks anymore. It's the silence of a phone that never rings. I used to think my father's insults were the cruelest thing I'd ever endure. I was wrong. Loneliness whispers in your own voice, telling you he was right. You are useless. I drank more than I should have. A beer after work became bottles lining my floor. The alcohol softened the edges, blurred the memories. But it also sharpened the truth I was wasting away. I stopped shaving, stopped showering regularly. I wanted to disappear, and I was facilitating the process. The lowest point came when I lost my job at the warehouse. "You're not reliable anymore," the manager said, his face half pity, half irritation. "We need someone who can show up sober. You fell asleep on the line." That word "sober" rang in my ears like a verdict. I walked out with an empty cardboard box of my things, empty just like me. That night I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the floor. I thought about calling home, calling my ex-wife, but the weight of humiliation held me back. What would I say? That my father was right all along. And the worst part was I agreed with him. Depression is heavy. Getting up felt like lifting mountains. Every movement was a struggle. I started missing visits with the kids. Not because I didn't want to see them, but because I couldn't bear the shame of showing up empty-handed. What kind of father brings his children to a bare apartment with nothing but pasta and tap water? So I made excuses. I told my wife I was sick or working. She didn't question it. Her silence was acceptance. You failed again. Each missed visit widened the distance. I hit rock bottom one rainy night. The bottle was nearly empty when I stumbled to the window. For a moment I thought about ending it, stepping out of that window and letting the world take me once and for all. The thought terrified me, but what terrified me more was how calm it felt, how easy. It felt like a merciful, permanent silence. I only pulled back when I saw the photo of my kids on the dresser. Their faces stared at me, innocent, trusting. I collapsed on the bed and wept like a child. The next morning I looked in the mirror. Bloodshot eyes, pale face, thick stubble. I was a ghost. I was hollow. And that day I made a choice. I couldn't be that ghost anymore. I had become a hollow shell drowning in regret. I had given up on being a husband, a father, a man. It was a Saturday afternoon when I was trying to shake off a hangover that I heard the knock on the door. It wasn't the landlord or a bill collector. It was softer, hesitant, but persistent. I almost didn't answer. When I opened the door, my son Liam was standing there. He looked taller than I remembered, older somehow. His backpack was slung over one shoulder. I stammered, "What are you doing here? Does your mother know?" He cut me off, his voice firm. "She thinks I'm at a friend's working on a project." I stood frozen in the doorway. The apartment was a mess. Dishes piled in the sink, empty bottles on the counter. The air smelled of stale whiskey and damp carpet. I watched his eyes scan the room and shame burned in my chest. This feeling was worse than my father's humiliation. "This is where you live now?" he asked quietly. The tone was not accusatory. It was just painful plain truth. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "It's temporary." He didn't say anything. He just dropped his backpack and sat down at the small, chipped table I'd found in a thrift store. He wasn't looking at the mess. He was looking at me. We sat there in silence for a while. The wheezing of the old fridge was the only sound. Finally, he broke the silence. "Dad, why don't you come home? I know you and Mum fight, but why don't you try?" The question hit me like a punch. It was the question I had been running from for months. I swallowed hard, trying to find an answer that wouldn't break him. "Your mum and I, we can't live together anymore. It's complicated." He shook his head, his eyes welling up. "I don't care about complicated." His voice cracked. "I don't care about the money. I don't care about the house. I just don't want you to leave us." The words lodged in my chest. I wanted to tell him I hadn't left. I had run away out of fear. But in that moment I realized the truth. I had abandoned them. With every missed visit, every unanswered call, every lie I told to hide my shame, I had abandoned them. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but the words weren't enough. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "You don't have to be perfect, Dad. You just have to be here." Something broke inside me then. Not the old fracture of humiliation, but a breaking that let the light in. His words were the hammer that shattered the wall of my despair. We spent the rest of the afternoon together. He asked for nothing but my presence. I cooked pasta, the only thing I knew how to make, and he laughed. We ate at the chipped table, and for the first time in months, I laughed for real. Before he left, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a photo. Him, his sister and me, taken years ago at the park. "Keep it," he said, "so you don't forget who you are, so you don't forget we need you." After he left, I sat there for a long time holding the photo. I stared at our smiles, and I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, not for me, but for them. I had to rebuild. The next morning, after my son's visit, I woke up before sunrise. For the first time in months, I had a reason to get up. There was a sliver of sunlight on the floor. I stood in the kitchen staring at the mess I had let pile up. Dirty dishes, empty bottles. It was a mirror of the man I had become. But his words echoed, "You just have to be here. Honestly." So I started small, the small things a decent man should do. I washed the dishes, not just rinsing them, but scrubbing until they shone, using my fingernails to clean the crusted food. I opened the curtains for the first time. I opened the windows, letting the stale, heavy air escape, letting the sunlight pour in. I bagged up the bottles, the trash, the pieces of failure I had surrounded myself with. The cleaning took the whole morning, and it was more exhausting than any physical labor. It didn't fix everything, but when I stepped back, the apartment looked different, cleaner, brighter. Maybe it could hold something more than regret. And maybe so could I. I started finding odd jobs, fixing fences, painting houses, hauling boxes, anything that paid. At first it felt humiliating, but when I came home sore and tired, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Every dollar wasn't just money. It was proof that I was trying. Proof that I wasn't useless, as my father had said. I sent a portion of the money to my ex-wife for the kids' expenses. It was a small amount, but it was a beginning. The kids noticed. One Saturday, my son looked at me and said, "You're different, Dad. You look better." I asked him what he meant. He shrugged, but his smile gave it away. "You don't look so sad anymore. You don't smell like beer." It nearly broke me, but this time with quiet emotion, because he was right. I started picking them up more often. Sometimes we'd walk in the park. Sometimes just sit together in the small apartment, watching old movies, eating cheap pizza. I listened more. I stopped trying to prove myself. I realized something. Being a father wasn't about having all the answers or having a big house. It was about being present enough to hear the questions. One evening, as my daughter was drawing at the table, she said, "I like it here." I glanced around at the small apartment, the peeling paint. "Here?" I asked. She nodded. "Because you smile more here. I feel like you're really here." That night, I let those words sink into me. It didn't matter where I lived or how little I had. What mattered was what they saw when they looked at me. I decided to face the past. I called my father for the first time in months. My voice was shaky, but I said, "I'm doing well. I'm building things back." I wasn't asking for anything, just giving an update. But a few days later, a letter arrived. "Your father is seriously sick. The farm is dying. If you can come home just once." I drove all night, back to the farm, back to the place that had ruined me. But this time I didn't return as a runaway child. I returned as a man who had started rebuilding himself. Healing didn't come in one grand miracle. It came slowly in pieces, like cracks in ice melting when spring arrives. When I arrived at the farm, I found my father on the porch, thinner and weaker than I remembered. He looked at me. We both stood there in silence. Finally, he nodded toward the barn. "It's about to fall down." The days that followed were awkward and silent at first. We worked side by side, forced together by the needs of the farm. We lifted a rotten beam together. His hand brushed mine. For the first time in 10 years, he didn't pull away. He started asking about my work in the city without criticism. My mother smiled when she heard the faint sound of us laughing in the barn as we struggled with an old tool. I sat with him on the porch, not as a rival or a disappointment, but as a son. The farm reflected it. The crops grew taller, stronger, as if they sensed the peace returning to the soil. We ate together again. Initially, silence filled the table, but gradually conversation returned. He asked how the fields looked. I told him about a stubborn patch of weeds, and sometimes, rarely, he laughed. True laughter, not the dismissive kind. On another evening, after a long day in the fields, we sat across from each other. He set down his fork, his hands trembling. He looked at me with eyes I barely recognized, soft or weary. I was wrong, son, he said, his voice raw. He continued, his gaze dropping to the table. I thought I had to make you tough. I thought breaking you was the only way you'd survive. But all I did was push you away. I stole your youth with fear. His voice cracked, and for the first time in my life I saw tears fill my father's eyes. Something inside me cracked too. All the years of anger, humiliation, loneliness, they collided in that moment. "You hurt me, Dad!" I forced the words out. "You made me believe I was worthless. I left because I couldn't bear it anymore." He nodded, his jaw trembling. "I know, and I'll never forgive myself for it. I'm sorry." Then slowly I reached across the table. My hand covered his. His skin was rough, calloused, but his grip tightened around mine. No more words were needed. We had finally seen each other. My mother, who had been silent all this time, let out a sob and covered her face. My healing with my ex-wife and children also progressed. One evening, when I dropped the kids off, she lingered at the door. "You look different," she said. "You stopped destroying yourself, I see that." "I'm trying," I replied, "for them." She gave the smallest of smiles. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement that I was trying. Later, she invited me inside just for coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the very one where she had humiliated me. "I was angry," she admitted. "I felt like you had given up. I felt I was carrying everything alone, and I hurt you so you would feel that pain too." She was right. "I did give up," I said quietly, "and I'm sorry for all of it, for letting you down when you needed me most." The silence that followed wasn't sharp anymore. It was soft, like a blanket pulled over something fragile. Weeks passed, and she let me stay for dinner. The kids beamed when I sat at the table. We were laughing again, awkwardly, carefully, but laughter nonetheless. The reunion wasn't marked by any grand event. It was simple, ordinary, yet it was everything we had lost and finally regained. It was Christmas Eve. I drove back to the farm. Snow was falling gently, covering everything in a clean white blanket. Inside the old house, the scent of fresh pine and baking bread was thick. My mother moved between the stove and the table with a quiet hum. My father sat at the head of the table, frail, but his posture proud. He looked at me, not with judgment, but with something far rarer, peace and acceptance. I arrived with the children. My ex-wife came too as a friend and honored guest. We ate together. No sharp silence, no tension heavy in the air. My father told an old story about fixing a tractor in the dead of winter. I added my own memories, and they were met with nods, smiles, and belonging. Halfway through the meal, I realized my hands weren't clenched. My shoulders weren't tight. I wasn't bracing for a blow that never came. I was simply there, a son eating with his parents, and it was enough. When the meal was done, we stepped outside. Snow was still falling. My father rested his hand on my shoulder. His grip was weak but steady. "This farm will outlive me," he said quietly, looking out at the snow-covered fields. "But I hope it never outlives what we found again." I swallowed hard. "It won't, Dad," I told him. "Not this time. We'll hold on to it together." My mother slipped her arm around both of us, and for the first time in my memory, we stood together, united whole. The farm had been a battlefield, but now I saw it as the place we were rebuilt. And in that moment, I knew we were home. In the city house, the healing was also cemented. One Sunday night, my ex-wife invited me to stay for dinner, not just as a guest, but as part of the family. My son Liam raised his glass of soda and said, "To us." We all clinked glasses. My wife met my eyes. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't see anger or disappointment there. I saw acceptance, respect, a love that had transformed, had matured. I don't know what the future holds. We didn't remarry. We are friends, partners in parenting. But I know this, we are no longer broken. We built a new table, a new family on the foundation of truth and forgiveness. And being together is enough. That night, as I walked back to my apartment, I thought about the long road it had taken, the humiliation, the separation, the downfall, the rebuilding, the healing. It hadn't been easy, but it had been real. I had found myself not by running from the past, but by coming back and facing it. And as I looked up at the stars, I whispered a quiet thank you for second chances, for family, for love that refuses to die even when everything else falls apart. It was the sound of peace.